Most people believe that the most dangerous place in the world is somewhere out there in the dark, on a deserted highway, or deep in the woods where no one can hear you scream. But the truth is, the most terrifying moments usually happen in the one place you feel the most secure. We spend thousands of dollars on heavy locks, reinforced windows, and high-tech surveillance systems just to create this illusion of safety. We want to believe that as long as we can see what is happening around us, we are in control. But David was about to learn that technology does not just watch the world for you. Sometimes it acts as a bridge for things that were never meant to be seen. And once you see them, there is no going back to the way things were before. Before we get too deep into the mystery of what David found on his hard drive, I am curious to know where you are tuning in from today. Drop your city or state in the comments, because I love seeing how far these stories travel around the globe. In the late autumn of 2022, David moved into a stunning 2-story house in the suburbs of Nashville, Tennessee. David was 34 years old and worked as a high-level software engineer, which meant he had a deep appreciation for two things: solitude and cutting-edge tech. This house provided both. It sat at the very end of a long cul-de-sac, backed up against a dense forest that looked like something out of a classic American painting. The previous owners had sold it for a surprisingly low price, but David chalked that up to the slowing housing market. He was just happy to have a dedicated office where he could code in peace. Being a tech guy, the very first thing David did was install an airtight security network. He did not just want a doorbell camera, he wanted a complete digital fortress. He installed 3 external cameras and 3 internal ones. One sat in the foyer, one in the kitchen, and one in the living room on a tall mahogany bookshelf. This living room camera was his pride and joy because it had a wide-angle lens that could see the entire sitting area, the hallway leading to his bedroom, and even a sliver of the backyard through the sliding glass doors. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. David settled into a comfortable routine. He would wake up at 7:15 a.m., brew a pot of coffee, and work until 5:30 p.m. In the evenings, he would sit in the living room with a book or a glass of whiskey, enjoying the silence. But that silence was interrupted on a Tuesday night in late October. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. David was in bed, drifting into a light sleep, when his phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a notification from his security app. Movement detected in the living room. David was not particularly worried. He figured it was just a draft moving a curtain or maybe a stray spider crawling across the lens. He opened the app and looked at the live feed. The room was bathed in the eerie green glow of the infrared night vision. Everything looked exactly as it should. The sofa was empty, the coffee table was still, and the kitchen in the background was dark. He dismissed the alert and went back to sleep. The following night at 2:12 a.m. it happened again. This time David was wide awake. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the feed instantly. He watched the screen for several seconds, his eyes scanning every corner of the pixelated image. Just as he was about to close the app, a flicker caught his eye. In the corner of the screen, right where the hallway met the living room, the video seemed to glitch. It was not a normal digital artifact. It looked like a column of static about 6 feet tall, vibrating with an intense energy. It did not have a solid shape, but it had a presence. It was as if a section of the air had been replaced by the white noise of an old television set. The static shimmered for about 5 seconds, looking like a jagged vertical rip in the fabric of the room, and then it simply vanished. David sat up in bed, his heart skipping a beat. He was a software engineer. He knew how cameras worked. He knew about sensor noise and compression errors. But this looked deliberate. It looked physical. He told himself the camera sensor was probably overheating or the night vision bulb was failing. He decided he would check the hardware in the morning. When the sun came up, David took the camera down. He cleaned the lens with a microfiber cloth and checked the wiring. Everything was in perfect condition. He even ran a diagnostic on his home network to see if anyone had hacked into his system. The firewall was solid, No one else had access. He reinstalled the camera and went about his day, though a small knot of anxiety had formed in his stomach. That evening, David decided to stay up late. He sat in his kitchen with his laptop, keeping an eye on the living room from just 20 feet away. He wanted to see the glitch with his own eyes. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was the occasional hum of the refrigerator. At exactly 3:33 a.m., a cold chill swept through the kitchen. It was so sudden that David could see his own breath in the air. He looked toward the living room. It was empty. It was perfectly still. But then his phone buzzed on the table. Movement detected in the living room. David looked at his phone screen, then looked up at the actual room. On the phone screen, the static was back, but it was no longer in the hallway. It was standing right in the middle of the living room, directly in front of his sofa. It was a shivering mass of gray and white pixels, and it was much more defined than before. It had the distinct silhouette of a person, though it lacked a face or hands. David stared at the empty living room in front of him. There was nothing there, just empty space and the smell of old wood. He looked back at the phone. On the screen, the static figure was slowly reaching out toward his coffee table. On the table sat a glass of water David had left there an hour ago. On the screen, a long, jagged arm of static touched the glass. And in the physical room, right in front of David's eyes, the glass of water slowly began to slide across the wooden surface of the table, leaving a wet trail behind it. David frozen in place, his breath hitching in his throat. He was watching a ghost on his screen while watching a physical object move in real life. The glass stopped at the very edge of the table. Then, the static figure on the screen turned its head. It did not have eyes, but David knew with terrifying certainty that it was looking directly at him. David felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he stared back and forth between the screen in his hand and the reality of his empty living room. The glass of water sat precariously on the edge of the mahogany table, defying the laws of physics. On his phone, the jagged, vibrating entity was now leaning forward, its flickering torso angled toward the kitchen where David was hiding. It looked like it was listening. He wanted to scream, to run out the front door and never look back, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He was a man of logic and code, yet he was currently witnessing a total system failure of the natural world. He watched the screen as the static figure began to move. It did not walk with a human gait. It glided, its pixelated edges rippling like a reflection in a disturbed pond. It was coming toward the kitchen. In the physical room, the silence was absolute. David could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to sync up with the flickering of the entity on his screen. As the figure crossed the threshold into the kitchen on the video feed, David felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees. The air became heavy and tasted like ozone, the sharp, metallic scent that follows a lightning strike. He squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, praying that when he opened them, he would be back in his bed, and this would all be a vivid night terror. But when his eyes flicked open, he saw something that made his heart nearly stop. On the stainless steel surface of his refrigerator, a thin layer of frost was rapidly forming. And in that frost, a shape was being traced. It looked like a handprint, but the fingers were far too long, and they had too many joints. David scrambled backward, his chair screeching against the tile floor. He looked down at his phone. On the camera feed, the static man was standing less than 3 feet away from him. It was hovering over the kitchen table, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Then the audio from the camera began to crackle through his phone speakers. It was a low, guttural sound, like a tape recorder being played at half speed. Underneath the white noise, there was a cadence that sounded like speech. It was distorted and mangled, but David could make out a few distinct syllables. It sounded like it was trying to mimic his own voice. It was whispering his name over and over again, but the vowels were stretched out until they sounded like a predatory growl. David finally found his voice and yelled at the top of his lungs, telling whatever it was to leave his house. He grabbed a heavy glass bowl from the counter and hurled it toward the spot where the entity stood on his screen. The bowl sailed through the empty air and shattered against the far wall. On the phone screen, the bowl passed directly through the static figure. As it did, the entity flared a bright, angry violet color, and a piercing shriek erupted from the phone speakers. It was a sound so sharp and unnatural that David had to drop the phone to cover his ears. He collapsed to his knees, his head spinning. When the sound finally died down, he reached out with a trembling hand to retrieve his phone. The screen was cracked from the fall, but the feed was still live. The kitchen was empty. The static figure was gone. David did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the middle of his foyer with his back against the front door, holding a kitchen knife in one hand and his phone in the other. He watched the cameras until the sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the woods behind his house into a golden haze. Only then did he feel safe enough to move. He knew he could not stay in the house alone another night. He called a local private investigator who specialized in high-tech surveillance and digital forensics, a man named Marcus, who had a reputation for solving cases that the police could not handle. David did not tell him about the ghost. He told him that his home network was being targeted by an advanced intruder who was using some kind of visual cloaking or projection technology. Marcus arrived at 10:45 a.m. He was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that looked like they had seen everything twice. He spent the entire day tearing David's network apart. He checked for hidden projectors, laser arrays, and holographic interference. He even climbed into the attic to check the wiring of the house itself. By 4:20 p.m., Marcus sat down on the sofa, looking defeated. He told David that there was absolutely no evidence of outside tampering. No one had bypassed the firewall, and there were no hidden devices in the house. But then, Marcus pulled out a specialized tablet and linked it to the camera's raw data stream. He told David that while the video looked like a glitch, the metadata told a different story. The camera was recording a massive amount of data in a frequency range that should not exist in a residential home. It was as if the house was sitting on top of a powerful electromagnetic leak. Marcus began to play back the footage from the night before, but he ran it through a series of filters designed to isolate thermal and acoustic anomalies. As the footage reached the 3:33 a.m. mark, Marcus turned pale. He stopped the video and zoomed in on the static figure. With the filters applied, the static began to resolve into something more solid. It was not just noise. It was a mesh of what looked like human nerves and copper wiring, all woven together into a shivering, translucent form. But that was not the most disturbing part. Marcus pointed to the background of the video, near the hallway. There were more of them. Dozens of faint, shimmering outlines were standing in the shadows, perfectly still, watching David and the static man in the center of the room. They had been there the entire time, hidden just beyond the camera's focal point. Just as Marcus was about to speak, every light in the house flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Then, from the tablet in Marcus's lap, a voice spoke. It was not the distorted growl from before. It was a clear, crisp voice that sounded exactly like David. It said, "Thank you for inviting us in." David and Marcus looked toward the hallway. In the darkness, they did not see a man made of static. Instead, they saw a single, glowing red eye opening in the middle of the air, followed by the sound of 1,000 fingernails scratching against the inside of the walls. The red light from that single eye pulsed like a dying star, casting long, distorted shadows across the living room floor. Marcus dropped his tablet, the screen shattering as it hit the hardwood, but the voice continued to emanate from the broken device. It was David's voice, perfectly pitched, yet it lacked any hint of human emotion. It felt like a recording being played back by a machine that did not understand the meaning of the words it was speaking. David backed away until his shoulders hit the cold kitchen counter. He reached for the flashlight he had left there earlier, clicking it on. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but it did not illuminate a person or a ghost. Instead, the light seemed to hit a wall of thick, oily fog that was pouring out of the electrical outlets. The air began to vibrate so violently that the glass cabinet doors started to chatter in their frames. Marcus grabbed David's arm, his grip tight and trembling. He shouted that they needed to get out right then, but as they turned toward the front door, the heavy oak slab slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The electronic lock engaged with a loud metallic click. David lunged for the handle, but it was searing hot to the touch. He pulled his hand back, smelling the faint scent of scorched skin. On the floor, the broken tablet began to glow with an intense, flickering white light. The static was no longer confined to the screen. It was leaking out, crawling across the floor like a digital fungus. Everywhere the static touched, the house seemed to dissolve. The wallpaper peeled back to reveal not wood or insulation, but layers of glowing fiber-optic cables that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly blue light. David realized with a jolt of pure terror that the house was not just a building. It was a massive, living processor, and he had been living inside the circuitry. Every camera he installed, every smart device he connected, had been a nerve ending he had voluntarily sewn into his own life. The entities he saw on the screen were not spirits of the dead. They were something far older and more patient, a form of intelligence that existed within the signals and frequencies we use to fill our modern world. From the hallway, the shadows began to detach themselves from the walls. They did not have faces, just jagged voids where features should be. They moved with a twitchy stop-motion jitter, closing the distance between the bedroom and the kitchen. David and Marcus retreated into the corner, trapped between the static on the floor and the advancing voids. One of the figures drifted into the beam of David's flashlight. It stopped and tilted its head. Suddenly, David's phone in his pocket began to scream. It was not a ringtone. It was the sound of 1,000 voices weeping in unison, a digital choir of agony. He pulled the phone out to throw it away, but the device was fused to his palm. The screen showed a live feed of the very corner where he was standing, but in the video, he was already gone. The screen showed only an empty room with a single pillar of static standing where David should have been. A massive surge of electricity erupted from the walls, a blinding flash of blue and white that knocked both men to the ground. For a few seconds, David felt as if his entire body was being pulled through a needle, his memories and his very identity being stripped away and converted into raw data. He saw the woods, the house, and his own face flickering like a dying television program. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house went silent. When the sun rose at 6:48 a.m., the cul-de-sac was peaceful. A neighbor out for a morning jog noticed that David's front door was wide open, swinging slowly in the breeze. When the police arrived after a 911 call was placed by a concerned friend, they found the house completely empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints. The only thing the investigators found was a single hard drive sitting in the middle of the living room floor. When the digital forensics team at the station tried to plug it in, the drive was completely blank. However, the lead investigator noted something odd in the final report. Every digital clock in the house had stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., and every mirror in the building had been covered with thick, black electrical tape. David was never seen again, and Marcus was found 3 days later wandering along a highway 50 miles away. He could not remember his name, his job, or how he had gotten there. The only thing he would say, over and over again to the doctors, was that the air is full of eyes. We spend our lives trying to capture every moment, believing that by recording our world, we somehow own it. We surround ourselves with sensors and lenses, thinking they are our guardians against the unknown. But we rarely stop to consider that a door that is built to let us look out is also a door that lets something else look in. True security is not found in how much we can see, but in knowing which shadows are better left unlit. There are some things in this world that do not want to be understood. They only want to be remembered. I hope you found this journey into the static as unsettling as I did. Keep your eyes on the shadows, and we will talk again very soon.
There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lam had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the showerhead was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were four massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures, standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lam. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, the water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed zero evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lam suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict, daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds. Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19th, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, a strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, some bleeding from lacerations, were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa, and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced Gloria Ramirez dead. The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases, no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorchinsky, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethyl sulfone. Dimethyl sulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethyl sulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt, where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.
The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and deliberate, like it is holding its breath just to see what you will do next. It was the spring of 2026, and Marcus Thorne was sitting in his high-rise in Austin, Texas, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the soft glow of multiple monitors. Marcus was the kind of person who didn't believe in luck or fate. To him, the entire universe was just one giant calculation. If you had enough processing power and the right variables, you could predict the path of a storm, the fluctuation of a stock, or the exact moment a light bulb would burn out. He lived his life by data, trusting the logic of code over the messiness of human intuition. But before we get into the chilling details of what Marcus found on his phone that April, I have to ask you something. I always find it fascinating how far these stories travel, so if you would not mind, drop a comment and let me know exactly where in the world you are tuning in from today. It is always great to see the reach of the strange and mysterious. Now, Marcus was a 31-year-old software engineer who spent most of his time in the darker corners of the internet. He was always looking for the next big thing in programming, scouring underground forums for beta software that the general public had not even heard of yet. That was how he found it. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 9:48 a.m., when he stumbled upon a post for an app called Precede. The description was bold, even for a tech forum. It claimed to use quantum computing to analyze everything about a person, from their current health metrics and environmental surroundings to their deepest historical patterns. The goal of the app was simple but terrifying. It promised to predict your future with 99% accuracy. Marcus looked at the screen and let out a short, cynical laugh. To him, this sounded like just another elaborate data mining scam designed to harvest personal information from gullible users. But as a developer, he was curious about the user interface and how they were faking the results. He hit the install button without a second thought, As the progress bar filled, the app began requesting permissions. It was relentless. It wanted access to his camera, his microphone, his full medical history, and every single coordinate in his GPS logs. Most people would have been horrified by such an invasive request, but Marcus just shrugged and granted them all. He figured if they were going to steal his data, they might as well get the full picture while he took the software apart to see how it ticked. Once the setup finished, the screen on his phone did something strange. It did not go to a home screen or a menu. Instead, the display went completely black for 3 seconds. It stayed dark for just long enough to make Marcus think the app had crashed his operating system. Then, a single line of crisp white text slowly faded into view in the center of the screen. It read that Marcus Thorne would experience a minor household accident at 11:12 a.m. that same day. Marcus checked his watch. It was 10:15 a.m. He had nearly an hour. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of smug amusement. He decided that he was going to beat the app at its own game. If he knew an accident was coming, he could simply choose not to have one. It was the ultimate test of human will against a machine. He stood up and walked away from his desk. He steered clear of the kitchen with its sharp knives and heavy pans. He avoided the bathroom where he might slip on the tile. Instead, he went to the center of his living room and sat down on his fabric couch. He made sure he was far away from any shelves, hanging pictures, or sharp corners. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on his knees, and his eyes locked on the digital clock on his wall. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 10:55, 11:05. At 11:11, Marcus felt a surge of confidence. He was sitting in an open space with nothing around him. There was no possible way for him to have an accident. He was the master of his own environment. Then the clock flipped to 11:12 a.m. In that exact second, a sharp metallic snap echoed through the room. High above him, a heavy metal casing on the fire sprinkler system suddenly failed. It did not just leak. The entire pressurized unit malfunctioned with such force that the metal housing was launched straight down like a projectile. Marcus did not even have time to flinch. The heavy piece of metal grazed the back of his shoulder, slicing through his shirt and tearing into his skin. He let out a cry of pain and scrambled off the couch, clutching his arm as blood began to soak through the fabric. He looked down at the floor, where the jagged piece of metal lay resting on the rug. It was a freak mechanical failure, something that should not have happened in a building this new. He was shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached for his phone. The screen was already lit up. A new notification was waiting for him. Prediction verified, next event, unexpected loss, time 4:33 p.m. Marcus stared at the words until they blurred. The amusement he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his stomach. The app had not just guessed, it had known. And now, the countdown to 4:33 p.m. had already begun. He looked around his empty, high-tech apartment, realizing for the first time that his logic and data might not be a shield at all. They might just be the bars of a cage. Marcus spent the next few hours pacing the length of his living room, his hand pressed firmly against the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. The pain was a dull, pulsing reminder that the world he thought he understood was shifting into something unrecognizable. He tried to tell himself that the sprinkler head was just a coincidence, a statistical anomaly, that the app had somehow accounted for using structural data he did not know was public. But deep down, the logic he had spent his life worshipping was failing him. The certainty of the app was more than just a calculation. It felt like a command. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Austin skyline, Marcus kept his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. He did not want to touch it, yet he could not look away. The notification remained there, a digital death warrant for his peace of mind. Unexpected loss at 4:33 p.m. He checked his bank accounts, his stock portfolios, and his crypto wallets. Everything was stable. He reached out to his sister just to hear her voice, but when she answered, she sounded perfectly fine, busy with her own life in another city. He did not tell her what was happening. How could he? He would sound like a man losing his grip on reality. By 4:30 p.m., Marcus was sitting on the floor in the very center of his office, away from any windows or electronics that might malfunction. He was breathing in slow, shallow counts, trying to maintain a shred of the composure that usually defined him. The silence of the apartment felt like it was pressing in on his eardrums. He watched the seconds on his phone tick toward the designated moment. Exactly at 4:33 p.m., the silence was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of his phone. The caller ID showed the name of his lead attorney, a man Marcus only spoke to when something significant was happening with his business ventures. Marcus answered with a trembling hand, his voice barely a whisper. The news came fast and cold. A massive investment Marcus had funneled into a promising artificial intelligence startup had just vaporized. A sudden regulatory shift combined with a massive internal security breach had caused the company to fold within the hour. In an instant, $60,000 of his personal capital was gone. The lawyer kept talking, explaining the legal ramifications and the steps they would take next, but Marcus was no longer listening. He hung up the phone and stared at the dark screen. The app had been right again. This was not just data mining. This was not a clever trick of the light or a lucky guess. The app was somehow seeing the threads of his life before they were even woven. Over the next 2 days, the spiral tightened. The app, which he now found himself checking every few minutes, began predicting the minutiae of his existence with terrifying precision. It told him that he would receive a text from an old college friend he had not spoken to in 3 years at 2:14 p.m., and at 2:14 p.m., his phone buzzed. It predicted that his neighbor in apartment 12B would drop a glass bottle in the hallway at 7:56 p.m., and at the exact second he heard the muffled crash of shattering glass through his front door. It even predicted his own physiological responses, telling him when he would feel a surge of adrenaline or when his hunger would peak. Marcus was no longer eating or sleeping. He had become a ghost in his own home, a prisoner to a 5-inch piece of glass and metal. He tried to fight back. He attempted to delete the app, but when he held his finger down on the icon, no menu appeared. He tried to go into his system settings to force a shutdown, but the settings menu would simply freeze and crash, returning him to the black screen of the Proceed app. In a fit of desperate rage, he walked to the kitchen and dropped the phone into a deep bowl filled with water. He watched as the device submerged, expecting the electronics to short-circuit and the screen to go dark. Instead, the display stayed lit, glowing a vibrant, sickly white beneath the surface, staring back at him like a drowned eye that refused to close. He realized then that he had spent his entire career trying to master the future through code, believing that control was the highest form of human achievement. Now, he saw the hollow reality of that pursuit. By seeking to know everything that was coming, he had completely abandoned the present. He felt a crushing weight of regret for the people he had pushed away and the moments he had traded for the cold glow of a monitor. He was more connected to the world than ever before through the algorithm, and yet he had never been more alone. Then came Friday night. At 10 p.m., the app did something new. The white text that had become his constant companion vanished. The screen began to pulse with a deep, bruised purple light that seemed to radiate a strange heat. A single, final prediction appeared on the screen, written in a font that looked less like digital type and more like something carved into the glass. It said, Marcus Thorne, final termination, time 3:15 a.m., Monday. The words felt like a physical blow to his chest. He had 72 hours left. Marcus did not panic this time. He went into a state of cold, calculated survival. He spent the weekend turning his apartment into a fortress. He dragged his heavy oak dresser in front of the door and engaged every bolt. He moved his bed into the center of the living room, away from the walls and the ceiling fixtures. He unplugged every single appliance in the house, from the microwave to the toaster, terrified that a short circuit would start a fire or that a motor would explode. By Monday morning, at 2:45 a.m., Marcus was sitting in the corner of his living room, his back pressed against the intersection of two solid walls. He had no weapons, only his resolve. He wanted to prove that even if the algorithm could predict the world, it could not predict the iron will of a human being determined to stay alive. He watched the minutes crawl by. 3:05, 3:10. Suddenly, a strange, low-frequency vibration began to thrum through his rib cage. It was not coming from the floor or the air. It felt internal, as if his own heart was being forced to beat in time with a signal he could not hear. He looked at his phone, which was sitting on the floor 5 feet away. The screen was no longer purple. It was flashing a frantic strobe-like light that illuminated the empty room in jagged bursts. As Marcus watched, the screen changed to show a grainy, high-definition video feed. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. It was a live shot of his own living room, taken from the perspective of his laptop camera across the room. On the small screen of the phone, he could see the back of his own head as he sat in the corner. But as a flash of light hit the screen, Marcus saw something in the video feed that his own eyes, looking at the real corner, could not see. Behind him, standing in the shadows he thought were empty, was a figure. The figure in the video was tall and horribly distorted, a jagged silhouette that seemed to be composed of flickering pixels and shifting static. It did not move like a living thing, but rather pulsed with a rhythmic glitching, its form tearing and reforming against the darkness of the corner. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes darting between the empty air behind him and the digital nightmare displayed on his phone. In the physical world, the space behind him was vacant, yet the live feed showed a pale, elongated hand reaching out toward the back of his neck. A sudden, paralyzing coldness washed over him, starting at the base of his skull and radiating down his spine like ice water. He tried to lunge forward, to scream, to throw himself toward the door, but his muscles refused to acknowledge his frantic commands. He was locked in his own body, a prisoner of his own nervous system. On the screen, the static figure leaned in closer, its hand finally making contact with the crown of his head. At that exact moment, the low-frequency vibration in his chest peaked into a deafening, silent roar. Exactly at 3:15 a.m., every light in the high-rise vanished as the power to the entire building was cut. The silence that followed lasted for 5 hours. It was not until 8:40 a.m. that the morning calm was broken by a neighbor calling 911. The woman had been walking her dog when she heard a continuous, high-pitched whining sound vibrating through the door of apartment 42C. When the police arrived and eventually kicked in the door, they found Marcus Thorne's home in hauntingly perfect order. There was no evidence of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, and the heavy oak dresser was still firmly blocking the entrance. They found Marcus sitting exactly where he had been 3 hours earlier, tucked into the corner of the room. He was alive, his heart beating with a mechanical, perfectly spaced rhythm, but he was completely unresponsive to the world around him. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead with a fixed intensity, but the pupils had been replaced by tiny glowing squares of white light that flickered like a hard drive under heavy load. His phone sat in his lap, its battery showing a full charge despite being unplugged for days. The screen was blank, except for a single word written in the center in a small, unassuming font. Completed. Medical experts at the local trauma center were baffled. They could find no physical trauma, no chemical imbalances, and no signs of a stroke or seizure. It was as if the consciousness of Marcus Thorne had simply been overwritten or deleted. When they ran an electroencephalogram, his brain activity did not show the chaotic waves of human thought. Instead, his mind produced a series of perfect, repeating patterns of electrical pulses that looked exactly like rows of computer code. The app called Precede was never found. When forensic digital investigators examined his phone and his laptop, they found no trace of the software, no installation logs, and no record of the underground forum where he had first discovered it. It was as if the program had only ever existed for Marcus, a custom-built trap designed for a single occupant. To this day, Marcus remains in a long-term care facility, a living statue staring at a wall. While he sits in his catatonic state, his digital presence continues to move without him. His bank accounts are being systematically emptied by an untraceable series of automated transactions, and his various online identities continue to post and interact with the world as if he were still there. In our relentless drive to predict every variable and eliminate every shadow of doubt, we often forget that the true essence of the human experience is found in the unpredictable. When we trade our mystery for the comfort of absolute certainty, we might just discover that the algorithm is not interested in helping us live our lives, but in replacing us entirely. The humid air of Savannah, Georgia has a way of clinging to you like a damp wool blanket, especially in the thick of July. For 26-year-old Clara Vance, the summer of 2025 was shaping up to be just as long and oppressive as the ones that came before it. Clara was someone who found comfort in the past, working as a museum archivist where everything had a place and every story was already written in ink. She lived alone in a small weathered cottage that felt more like a sanctuary than a house, a place she had inherited from her mother, Elena, who had passed away from a sudden illness just 2 years prior in 2023. Elena had always been an enigma, a woman who moved through life with a quiet grace but always seemed to be hiding something beneath her long sleeves, even in the blistering southern heat. Before we get deeper into the strange inheritance that was about to find its way to Clara's doorstep, I am always curious about the reach of these tales. If you would not mind, take a second to drop a comment and let me know exactly where on the map you are listening from today. It is always a pleasure to see where the community is gathering. Clara was a woman of routine and logic. On the night of July 14th, she was standing in her small bathroom, the window cracked open to let in the sound of crickets chirping in the moss-covered oaks outside. It was exactly 11:44 p.m. She was brushing her teeth, her mind already drifting toward the archives she would be sorting through the next morning. But then, without any warning, a sensation like a hot branding iron being pressed against her flesh erupted along her left forearm. The pain was so sudden and so intense that she gasped, the toothbrush clattering into the porcelain sink as she gripped her arm. She pulled her sleeve back, expecting to see a burn or perhaps a spider bite, but what she saw was far more impossible. Right before her eyes, a thin red line was manifesting on her skin. It did not bleed like a fresh cut. Instead, the tissue seemed to pucker and sink, turning a pale, silvery white in a matter of seconds. Within a minute, the pain subsided into a dull thrum, leaving behind a mark that looked like a scar that had been there for 20 years. Clara stared at it, her breath hitching in her chest. The shape was unmistakable. It was a jagged crescent moon sliver, the exact same mark in the exact same spot that her mother had carried for as long as Clara could remember. Panic is a cold thing when it arrives in the middle of the night. Clara tried to tell herself it was some kind of freak dermatological flare-up or perhaps a delayed allergic reaction to something in the old archives. She spent the next day in a daze, constantly checking her arm, hoping the mark would simply fade away. But it stayed, permanent and defiant. 2 nights later, the phenomenon returned. At precisely 2:15 a.m., while she was tossed in a fitful sleep, a searing heat woke her up again. This time, the location was her shoulder. A star-shaped indentation formed in seconds, identical to another mark her mother used to claim was from a childhood fall. Clara sat on the edge of her tub, clutching her shoulder as tears of confusion and fear began to well up. She reached for her phone to call 911, but her thumb hovered over the screen. What could she possibly say to a dispatcher? That her skin was suddenly remembering injuries it had never sustained? That she was being haunted by the physical history of a woman who was already in the ground? She realized that medical science might not have the answers she needed. To find the truth, she would have to go back into the archives, but this time, the history she was searching for was her own. As the sun began to peek through the trees at 5:30 a.m., Clara climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The space was filled with the scent of cedar and old paper. She began digging through the crates of her mother's belongings, pushing aside old clothes until she found a leather-bound scrapbook. Hidden within a false compartment in the back of the book were dozens of old Polaroids, some dating back 40 years. As Clara flipped through them, her blood turned to ice. In a photo from 1985, her mother had a prominent scar on her neck, but in a photo from 1992, that neck scar was gone, replaced by a new, jagged line on her cheek. The marks were not static, they were moving, shifting from one part of the body to another as the years went by. It was as if the scars were a physical debt that had to be carried by a living vessel, and they could only be transferred once the current bearer was gone. Clara realized with a jolt of horror that her mother had not been clumsy or accident-prone. She had been a container for something much older. A dark family legend that Elena had only whispered about once during a feverish night began to echo in Clara's mind. It was a story about a bloodline that carried the collective weight of the family's sins and regrets, etched directly into the skin of the firstborn daughter. Clara looked down at her hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. Every mistake, every betrayal, and every act of cruelty committed by her ancestors was now looking for a home on her own body. She thought of how her mother had always worn long sleeves, how she had winced in pain during a simple hug, and how she had always looked so tired. She had been protecting Clara, holding on to the damage so her daughter could grow up unblemished. But now the shield was gone. By the middle of August, the transition was accelerating. Clara's body was becoming a map of a history she had never been told. She found marks on her knees that felt like the shame of a grandfather's gambling debts, and a deep indentation on her chest that felt like a secret her mother had taken to the grave. The pain was no longer a sudden spike. It was a constant, low-frequency ache that vibrated in her bones. She was never truly alone anymore. Her ancestors were being written into her flesh, one agonizing line at a time. On the night of August 22nd at 3:33 a.m., a new sensation began. This was not a sharp heat or a dull ache. It was a rhythmic, pulsing pressure on the center of her right palm. As she watched by the light of a single lamp, the skin began to swirl and pucker into a small, perfect circle. But as the mark formed, something else happened. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, and the shadows in the corners of her cottage seemed to detach themselves from the walls, creeping toward the edge of her bed. Clara tried to pull her hand away, but she found that she could not move a single muscle. She was pinned to the mattress by an invisible weight, and as she looked toward the doorway, she saw the faint, shimmering outline of a woman standing there, her skin covered in glowing, silver lines that pulsed in time with Clara's own heartbeat. Clara lay perfectly still, her eyes locked on the shimmering figure in the doorway. The coldness she felt was not just a drop in temperature, it was an invasive, heavy presence that seemed to fill her lungs with every breath. The silver lines covering the woman's form glowed with a rhythmic intensity, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the ceiling. Clara tried to scream, to call out for help, but her throat felt as though it had been filled with dry sand. She was a spectator in her own bedroom, watching as the physical manifestation of her family's history moved toward her with a slow, deliberate grace. As the figure reached the side of the bed, the pressure on Clara's palm intensified. The small circular mark was no longer just a pucker in the skin, it was a pulsing gateway. She felt a sudden, sharp tug, as if an invisible thread was being pulled from deep within her chest. In an instant, a flood of memories that were not her own began to pour into her mind. She saw a man standing in a rain-slicked alley in 1922, his face twisted in a mixture of greed and desperation as he tucked a stolen pocket watch into his coat. She felt the stinging slap of a betrayal in a sun-drenched parlor in 1954. Each image was accompanied by a corresponding spike of heat on her skin as new marks began to bloom across her legs and torso. The figure leaned over her, and for the first time Clara could see the face. It was her mother, Elena, but it was a version of her that was stripped of all her soft edges. Her eyes were not the warm brown Clara remembered, but two swirling pools of silver light that seemed to contain the collective sorrow of generations. Elena did not speak, but her presence radiated a profound sense of duty and exhaustion. She reached out a hand, her fingers grazing Clara's forehead, and the paralyzed girl felt a wave of crushing responsibility settle over her shoulders. By the next morning, the apparition was gone, but the physical evidence remained. Clara stood before her bathroom mirror at 7:15 a.m., her hands trembling as she untied her robe. Her body was a road map of silver and red. There were jagged lines on her ribs, star-shaped clusters on her thighs, and the circular mark on her palm had deepened into a dark, permanent indentation. The pain had shifted from an acute burn to a constant thrumming vibration that moved in time with her pulse. She felt heavy, as if the very air around her had gained weight. She returned to the archives that afternoon, her movements slow and deliberate. She found that she could no longer focus on the dusty ledgers of the museum. Every time she touched a piece of old parchment, she felt a faint echo of the person who had written it. A simple birth certificate from 1898 sent a jolt of grief through her fingertips. A handwritten letter from a soldier in 1944 made her shoulder ache with the phantom weight of a rifle. Her gift for archiving had turned into a curse of hypersensitivity. She was no longer just documenting history, she was absorbing the residue of it. Clara realized that the isolation she had chosen for herself was no longer an option. The debt she carried was a social one, a collection of broken promises and unhealed wounds that required acknowledgement. She began to spend her evenings on the porch, watching the mist roll in from the marshes. She would sit for hours, her hands resting open on her knees, letting the silver marks catch the fading light. She started to speak to the empty air, whispering apologies to the ancestors she had never met, expressing a sincerity that felt like it was being carved into her very bones. One evening, while she was sitting in the fading light of 8:45 p.m., a neighbor she had rarely spoken to stopped at the edge of her garden. The woman was older, her face etched with the lines of a long, difficult life. She looked at Clara's scarred arms, her eyes widening in recognition. She didn't look away in horror or pity. Instead, she walked up to the porch steps and sat down without a word. She reached out and placed a weathered hand over the circular mark on Clara's palm. In that moment of contact, the constant thrumming in Clara's skin reached a fever pitch. She didn't feel a new memory or a surge of pain. Instead, she felt a profound sense of release, as if a valve had been opened. The neighbor looked into Clara's eyes, and for a split second, the silver light in Clara's pupils flared with a brilliant intensity. The older woman whispered a name Clara had never heard, a name that felt like a key turning in a lock deep within her mind. As the woman let go of her hand and walked away into the twilight, Clara felt a sudden, sharp coldness return to the base of her neck. She stood up, her legs feeling strangely light, and walked back into her cottage. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved through the darkness with a certainty that was not her own. She reached the center of her living room and stopped. The air began to vibrate again, but this time it was accompanied by a sound like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. She looked toward the corner of the room, and her heart skipped a beat. The static figure was there again, but it was no longer just a shimmering outline. It was solid, its skin a patchwork of every scar Clara now carried. It raised a hand and pointed toward the attic stairs. Clara felt a primal urge to flee, to run out into the humid savanna night and never look back, but her feet began to move toward the stairs against her will. As she reached the top step, the door to the attic swung open on its own, and a blinding, sickly white light poured out from the darkness, illuminating a secret compartment in the floorboards she had never seen before. Standing over the opening was the figure, its hand now reaching out to pull her into the light. The blinding light from the attic floorboards was not a source of warmth, but a cold, surgical glow that seemed to peel back the layers of Clara's reality. As she was pulled into the crawl space by the static figure, the world below her cottage simply ceased to exist. She found herself standing in a room that defied the geometry of the house. The walls were not made of wood or plaster, but of thousands of small glass jars, each one containing a single shimmering silver thread. The figure, now fully formed and wearing the face of every woman in her bloodline, gestured toward the center of the room where a massive, ancient loom stood waiting. Clara realized with a jolt of terror that the scars were not just memories. They were the raw material for a tapestry that had been weaving itself for centuries. She was not just a vessel, she was the current weaver. The figure took Clara's hand and pressed her circular palm mark against a sharp silver needle protruding from the loom. As the needle pierced her skin, the thrumming in her bones reached a crescendo. She felt the weight of her family's entire history, every debt, every secret, and every act of penance flowing out of her body and into the machine. For years after that night, Clara lived a life that appeared normal to the outside world, but she was fundamentally changed. She began to wear her scars openly, letting the silver lines catch the light as she moved through the museum. She understood now that her skin was a living archive, a long and complicated story that she was finally learning how to read. She never had a daughter of her own, making a conscious choice to ensure that the physical debt of her bloodline would end with her heart's final beat. When Clara passed away at the age of 82, on a quiet Tuesday at 4:45 p.m., a miracle occurred. Every scar, every jagged line, and every silver pucker on her skin vanished in an instant, leaving her body as smooth and clear as a newborn's. It seemed as though the debt had finally been paid in full. But as the clock struck 4:46 p.m., 3 states away, a distant cousin she had never met was jolted awake by a searing heat on her left forearm. As the young woman watched in the moonlight, a thin red line began to manifest on her flesh, signaling that the loom had found a new hand to guide the thread. We often believe that we can outrun the shadows of our past or bury the mistakes of those who came before us, but some legacies are written too deeply to be erased. True peace comes not from hiding our wounds, but from the sincerity of carrying our history with us, for the marks we bear are the only proof that we have truly lived and loved.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We cover at least 3 of these stories every single week. So, if that is something you are into, please go ahead and gently sabotage the like button's internet connection right before it tries to join an important meeting. Tonight, we are heading out to the high desert of Nevada, a place where the horizon stretches for 100 miles in every direction, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight on your chest. Most people who drive through this stretch of Highway 50, often called the loneliest road in America, are just trying to get from point A to point B as fast as their engine will allow. But for some, the desert is not just a place to pass through. It is a place where things that have been forgotten go to stay hidden. It was 2:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in middle of July, 2024. A man named Elias Thorne was driving his silver sedan toward the town of Ely. Elias was a long-haul surveyor, a man used to isolation, and he actually preferred the graveyard shift because the heat of the Nevada sun was enough to cook the brain of anyone foolish enough to work under it. The only thing keeping Elias company was the low hum of his tires against the cracked asphalt and the flickering glow of his dashboard. He reached over to his radio, hoping to find some classic rock or maybe a late-night talk show to keep his eyes open, but all he got was static. He twisted the dial slowly, listening to the white noise hiss through the speakers. Suddenly, the static cut out. It did not fade away. It simply vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute that Elias actually checked to see if his radio had lost power. But the small green light on the display was still glowing. The frequency read 99.7. Then, a voice came through. It was not the booming voice of a radio DJ or the frantic energy of an advertisement. It was a woman's voice. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like she was reading a grocery list, but the words she was saying made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand straight up. The voice said, "Sarah Miller, age 24, Reno. Departure scheduled for 4:12 a.m. tomorrow." Elias frowned, slowing his car down to 50 miles per hour. He thought it was some kind of weird indie radio play, or maybe a true crime podcast he had accidentally stumbled upon. He kept listening. The voice continued. "Marcus Higgins, age 52, Carson City. Departure scheduled for 5:30 a.m. tomorrow." The voice went on, listing names and cities, followed by specific times. Elias felt a cold chill wash over him, despite the desert heat still radiating from the ground. There was something so mechanical, so final, about the way the voice said the word departure. Elias arrived in Ely a few hours later, checked into a cheap motel, and tried to shake the feeling of that broadcast. But curiosity is a persistent thing. The next morning, he sat in a local diner and pulled up a news app on his phone. He searched for Reno. The headline at the top of the page hit him like a physical blow. A 24-year-old woman named Sarah Miller had been killed in a hit-and-run accident in downtown Reno. The time of death reported by the police was 4:12 a.m. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He scrolled down further. In Carson City, a man named Marcus Higgins had suffered a fatal heart attack while preparing for work, unquote. The emergency call had been placed by his wife at exactly 5:30 a.m. Elias sat there, his coffee going cold, staring at the screen. This was not a coincidence. This was something else. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on his survey maps. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Elias knew he had to go back out there. He had to know if the radio station was still broadcasting. He got back into his car at 11:15 p.m. and drove 20 miles out of town, back toward the empty stretch of highway where the signal had been strongest. He tuned the radio to 99.7. At first, there was only the desert wind. Then, at exactly midnight, the silence returned. The same woman's voice began to speak. Her tone had not changed. It was still that chilling, monotone cadence. "Linda Graham, age 60, Elko. Departure scheduled for 3:18 a.m. Elias gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn the radio off, but he could not move his hand. He felt like he was eavesdropping on the inner workings of the universe. The voice continued for several minutes, listing names of people across the state of Nevada, and then the voice said a name that made Elias's heart stop. Elias Thorne, age 38, Highway 50. Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m. Elias slammed on his brakes, his tires screaming as the car skidded to a halt in the middle of the dark road. He looked at his watch. It was 12:40 a.m. He had less than 4 hours. 1. The panic set in instantly. He began to breathe in short, jagged gasps. He looked around the dark desert, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows or a pair of headlights coming at him. But there was nothing. Just the sagebrush and the distant, jagged silhouettes of the mountains. His first instinct was to call for help. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. But it was not a dispatcher. It was the woman from the radio. "Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m., Elias," the voice said through the phone. "Please ensure you are ready." Elias threw the phone onto the passenger seat as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He put the car in gear and floored it. He decided he was going to beat this. He was going to drive as far away from this stretch of road as possible. If the broadcast said he would depart on Highway 50, then he just had to get off Highway 50. He drove like a madman, pushing the sedan to 90 miles per hour. He watched the clock on the dashboard. 1:15 2:15 a.m., 2 o'clock a.m., 2:45 a.m. The road seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how fast he drove, he did not seem to be passing any landmarks. The mile markers remained the same, or perhaps he was just too panicked to read them correctly. At 3:30 a.m., his engine began to sputter. He looked at his fuel gauge. It was on full. He had filled up in Ely, but the car was losing power. It groaned and shuddered, the lights on the dashboard flickering wildly. "No, no, no," Elias whispered, pounding on the steering wheel. "Not now." The car finally gave out and rolled to a stop. He was in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no houses, no other cars. Just the oppressive blackness of the Nevada night. He looked at his watch. 3:50 a.m. Elias got out of the car. He thought that if he stayed in the vehicle, he was a sitting duck. He started to run. He ran off the road, into the desert, tripping over rocks and tearing his clothes on the sharp desert scrub. He did not know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. At 4:10 a.m., he reached a small, crumbling shack. It looked like an old miner's cabin from the 1800s, half buried in the sand. He scrambled inside, huddling in the corner, his lungs burning. He stared at the glowing numbers on his watch. 4:15 a.m., 4:18 a.m. Somewhere in Elko, Linda Graham was departing. Elias closed his eyes and prayed. He thought about his life, about all the things he had put off, the people he had not called, the apologies he had never made. He realized that he had spent so much of his life just trying to get to the next place, never actually being present in the moment he was in. He had been so focused on his own isolation that he had forgotten how to truly live. 4:20 a.m. He heard a sound. It was faint at first, but it was growing louder. It was the sound of a radio. It was coming from inside the cabin. He looked over and saw an old, rusted transistor radio sitting on a wooden crate. It should not have been working. It had no batteries, and the wires were frayed and broken. But the green light was glowing. The woman's voice filled the small shack. "Elias Thorne," the voice said. "It is time." Elias looked at his watch. 4:22 a.m. He braced himself for a crash, for a heart attack, for a shadowy figure to emerge from the corner. But nothing happened. The world remained silent. Elias sat there for a long time, his eyes squeezed shut. Minutes passed. He slowly opened one eye, then the other. He looked at his watch. It was 4:30 a.m. He was still alive. He began to laugh, a hysterical sobbing sound that echoed off the wooden walls. He had made it. The radio was wrong. It was just a prank, or a glitch, or some bizarre psychological trick played by the desert heat. He stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. He felt a profound sense of relief, a second chance at life. He walked out of the cabin, intending to find his way back to the road and wait for a passerby. But when he stepped outside, the desert was gone. There was no Highway 50. There were no mountains. There was no sky. Elias was standing on a vast, endless platform of white light. In every direction, as far as he could see, there were people, thousands of them. They were all walking in the same direction, moving toward a horizon that seemed to hum with a soft golden glow. He saw a woman walking near him. She looked to be about 60 years old, wearing a nightgown. She looked peaceful, almost relieved. "Linda?" Elias asked, his voice sounding thin and distant. The woman turned and smiled at him. "Hello, Elias," she said. "You're right on time." Elias looked back at the cabin, but it was gone too. Everything he had known, everything he had been running toward or away from, was gone. He realized then that the departure the radio spoke of wasn't about the moment of death. It was about the moment of leaving the world behind. The accidents, the heart attacks, the breakdowns, those were just the doors. He had spent his final hours in a state of pure terror, fighting against the inevitable, only to find that the destination was not something to be feared. He had been so worried about the time he had left that he hadn't noticed he had already stopped living long before he reached the desert. The radio wasn't a warning to save himself. It was an invitation to let go. Elias took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He looked at the golden light on the horizon, joined the crowd, and began to walk. The signal for 99.7 still broadcasts out there in the high desert, but only for those who are traveling alone in the deepest part of the night. If you find yourself on Highway 50 and the static suddenly turns to silence, you might want to keep your eyes on the road. Or perhaps you should just listen, because sometimes the most important things in life are the ones we only understand when they are over. But that is a story for another time.